Blake es estadounidense, residente de Toronto. Su trabajo es también director de cine. Su primera película estuvo bueno, su primer largometraje estuvo en la primera edición de Black Canvas, Prototype. Y también es conocido por sus trabajos de crítica en medios como CinemaScope. Y por último, el mediador de esta bella plática es una de las voces mexicanas jóvenes más interesantes y de mayor presencia, es Alonso Díaz de la Vega, a quien, bueno. Por motivos de fluidez con nuestros invitados, la plática va a ser en inglés. Va a ser una conversatoria entre ellos y después los invito a que participen. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, Pedro. Thank you very much, guys, for being here. There's, I think, a lot of stuff to talk about film criticism nowadays. And I would like to start with a very simple, or apparently simple question, but that I think is very important. Is there truly a new sort of film criticism nowadays that has come along with perhaps the millennial generation? Is there a break from an older tradition? Do you believe that?
It's definitely a new generation, I think. I don't know if it is a break stylistically, or at least not for me. It depends on probably who you ask. There's more people writing, more voices who are influenced by different things, I would say. But yeah, for me, I still look at kind of the prior generations and read them and influenced by them. So for me, it's sort of in a continuum, I hope. But there's certainly a break generationally. I think we're probably considered definitely a break from just even people writing in the early 2000s.
I guess I'm curious what prompts the question of if there is a new film criticism now.
Basically, well, the idea of this conversation is the idea of a new film criticism. And what I'm wondering is if you guys think that the new generations that are doing this job are doing it differently from older generations in some way. Perhaps in the political perspectives they are using, or the aesthetic ideas, the kind of films that we're talking about nowadays.
I think a lot of people are approaching subject matter in a more socially aware way, I would say. That would be probably the most distinctive feature of younger writers nowadays. But that's prompted by many things, obviously, going on in the world. But that certainly wasn't, I would say, if you looked at film criticism in the in the 80s, 90s, they were approaching it probably more formally, aesthetically. Now is a balance maybe between the two, or even more leaning toward kind of socio-cultural and political topics and issues like that?
Well, you get more feedback now, I think, instantly, and the feedback is public usually. When I write something, whether it's a formal piece of criticism for a magazine, or if it's just some quick comments on a blog or Letterboxd or something, like you get feedback, like whether it's on Twitter or comments on the blog, and that's obviously different from most of the modes of criticism that were print-based from before the 21st century, and you have to answer to your opinions in a way that's more always more present, and there's more discussion around it, which I think helps expedite the evolution of how people write about things. And ideally, you would say that this is causing the field of film criticism to grow and evolve in a way that makes it better and makes the discussion more dynamic. But I guess one could also point to drawbacks to this kind of democratization of voices and platforms and whatnot.
Now that you mentioned, Blake, the idea of democratization, I'm very interested in terms of style. How do you guys conceive style in film criticism as relevant in its relationship to the audience? I mean, there are critics who prefer a more academic, even experimental style. Not long ago, I heard a question on a similar forum to this one, in which someone asked, why not making more poetic or experimental film criticism? What do you guys make of that? Do you think it should be more free in terms of its artistic nature as a work of art in itself, or do you believe that it has a more journalistic obligation to the public?
Yes, absolutely. That's the mode of. I'm not a very actively present film critic. I write basically 4 pieces a year for CinemaScope magazine. So Jordan can obviously speak to the job of, like, the year-round job of being a film critic constantly. But when I write from the standpoint of someone who also makes films and who makes films that are themselves experimental and poetic. And so I don't really see too much of a divide between the types of films that I make and the kind of mindset that I'm in when I'm making those, and the mindset that I'm in when I'm writing about other people's films. I think there's a viewpoint oftentimes that when you have a film, you want the film criticism about that film to interpret the film, that the film is trying to convey an idea, and then the critic is supposed to come in and kind of expose what that idea is. But I think that the films that I am interested in writing about are fundamentally mysterious in a number of ways. Not necessarily in terms of the mystery genre, but I mean they are filled with a kind of opening up. The process of watching the film is a process of opening up and discovering what the mysteries of the film are, and how the film balances things that are unknown and how those become known over the course of the duration of the film. And this sort of, I guess, gets into the idea, the kind of explosion of interest in spoilers and whatnot. But I think that writing about a film is essentially to spoil the film, because I think every film should be digested as cold and blank slate as possible. And so it's always a balance of trying to write about a film that is analytical, but also doesn't concretize the movie, make it into something very specific and says, this movie is doing this movie is saying this, where I think most films, good or bad, are saying many things or could be taken in many different ways. And so I don't really want to write a piece of film criticism that's just saying, this film is doing this, and then you can either say, oh yes, it's doing this, and now I know what the film is doing, or I could just disagree with it and say, no, I got something else from it, and so therefore, this is not a good piece of criticism. But when you write about something more poetically or experimentally, I don't know if I would ever call it a work of art, but I do think there is an art to writing about a film that can open it up for people without narrowing the pathways into the film and to thinking about the film and understanding what the film is doing and why the film is important and worth your time to watch it. So yeah.
Yeah, I agree, but to go back to the beginning of your question, I guess when I write, I think a lot of writers are dictated, or their style is dictated sometimes by the publication, or the audience for that publication. So when we write for CinemaScope, that's clearly a different audience than if you're writing for IndieWire or whatever, more kind of, not mainstream, but like a slightly more widely read, commercially oriented publication. So yeah, you would I think you approach it stylistically different, maybe even subconsciously. I know I do. Even when I write between like a film comment and a CinemaScope, ostensibly they're the same audience, but there's still slight differences, I think, where you have to contextualize a little bit more for a film comment over a CinemaScope, for example. But I do agree that criticism itself is a form of, or there's artistic, it's an artistic outlet, and I read about films that I have never seen and might never see sometimes, and I think that's healthy and can be its own thing, and I also am not worried about people giving anything away when they write, and sometimes useful.
Yeah, I always write criticism from the perspective that the person who's reading it will have already seen the film. I don't really spend much time talking about the plot of the movie or setting up something so that someone who has not seen the film will be able to understand what I'm saying. I don't read criticism before I see a film, criticism on that film, and I would hope that someone doesn't read my piece on a film before they've seen the movie, because otherwise they won't know what I'm talking about. But with regards to like others, what you're saying about like IndieWire and these other things, I think it's kind of a matter of just like what I think that specifically is a kind of website that privileges a kind of film criticism as something that needs to go viral. Like I think it's filled with these kind of very snap judgments that are very extreme or radical in certain ways, and making very big proclamations of what a film is doing and whether or not it's going to be significant for the Oscar season or whatever, in a way that I think more interesting publications don't care about those things. And so you end up with a site that's more widely read like IndieWire because they're making extreme statements, and everyone wants a kind of extreme statement because it allows them to get excited about it.
Yeah, we should also, I guess, mention that we're privileged to, I guess, write for, or we write about the movies, at least I do, write about movies I like. I don't have to write, like if you work for an IndieWire or a newspaper or a weekly of some sort, like those people are on staff and they have to write about the new movies that are coming out on Friday or whenever they come out.
And you're competing for clicks, and so you have to not only write something that's punchy and will catch people's attention more than other things, but you also have to be published before them. And so you have to, as soon as the embargo lifts, you need to make sure your piece is ready to be out there and read, because it's a very quick turnaround now. And once people have read Variety and Hollywood Reporter and whatever other trade sites cover these films immediately, like they're already moving on to the next film, the next week's films, and so you have to have your stuff ready, and you have to stand out above the other people who are widely read and make sure that you're more widely read than they are. And so, yeah, it's not the ideal way of writing about art, and I don't think there's a reason why I don't read these publications. I just don't get anything. I discovered a long time ago there's not much value for me in reading work that's written with those aims, yeah.
I think you guys just touched on a very, very important subject, which is we live in a very mediatized world in which, yes, we have to work for clicks and so on. And it's very unfortunate that criticism has suffered much from that. And what I would like to ask you is, ideally, what do you think that film criticism should do for a reader? What sort of mission do you have as film critics? Particularly in an age such like this, in which criticism behaves a little bit like, industrial film criticism behaves like a PR office for the distributors and producers.
I don't know, the newspapers and other websites, bigger websites, are sort of like consumer guides in some sense, I think. Touching on what Blake said, you don't even have to read the piece to get the idea of they like or dislike a film. If you write for some of these other magazines, you have a lot more time, and the relationship between the reader and the audience should be different, probably. It probably is. Like Blake was saying, he doesn't even... or you can write about a movie in a way that you don't have to explain the plot and people aren't going to it. Sometimes a piece is published months after the movie's come out, and clearly you don't have to approach it in a way that if you were writing from a festival and the premiere is that day, clearly you have to write like what the movie's about in a sense. But yeah, it depends. Again, to me, it's depending on where you're writing, that dictates kind of the tone and your relationship between the reader. But in general, I would say I don't even write with the reader necessarily like in mind, if that sounds weird, but Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I'm basically just working out my own feelings. Working out my own feelings on a film in written form. Oftentimes, I have no way of talking about a film until I've written about it, and I'll know on some instinctive level how I feel about it. I'll know if I like it or if I don't like it. But when someone asks me, when I come out of a film, if I like something and I say yes, and they ask me why, I really have no response to that until I've actually had a chance to sit down and start writing about it. And so I think in a similar way, I do also have a privilege in order to be able to write about films that only about films that I like. I've been writing for CinemaScope now for 7 years this fall, and I've never written a negative review for them. I always write about films that I like. And so in that sense, it's a way of me being able to articulate how I feel about movies that I think are good, but it's also a form of advocacy. I'm not only writing about a film that I like, but also a film that I think perhaps needs some support, is a smaller film or a film that's being panned by enough people that I think it needs to be argued in favor of. So I think CinemaScope in particular is one of the few publications that is, I think, can be called an advocacy magazine. They are advocating for a type of cinema and a type of sensibility and a type of taste that the editors of that magazine have held for now 20 years since the magazine opened, started publishing, and they ask writers to contribute who they believe in some way or another align with their perspective. I think there's also this sense that there's a bit of groupthink with certain publications that I think you could say just because the editor is picking who's writing for them, there will be some commonality in the taste, but there's never any sense that I'm forced to like the films that the higher ups like. But I am arguing for my own personal sensibility when I'm writing, and all I can hope is that everyone in the world eventually watches movies the same way that I do.
But that's what's rare, I think, now, or more and more rare. There's less publications that have some sort of like unified voice. In some sense, you could be like, oh, that magazine liked the movie. Like, you don't even have to name the writer. So that's like they're taking a stance for a certain kind of cinema, which, as opposed to a trade magazine, which it could be any number of opinions within these publications or newspapers, whereas some of these quarterly magazines or just the few remaining magazines that exist, like there's less and less kind of unified criticism like that, which I enjoy actually. I would rather follow these magazines and kind of base my, or like if this magazine or this person likes this movie, might be something I'm interested in. Whereas I don't think you can do that with a lot of more widely read publications anymore.
I think you guys have described criticism in some way, particularly the sort of work that you do, as a sort of aesthetic militancy. I think you guys are part of the resistance which is trying to fight off in some way the prejudices of the industry and critics more oriented towards becoming a consumer guide. And what I'd like to ask you is, do you think that perhaps the social networks, this electronic environment might help to achieve that end, to manage to find more people who care about the films that you care about, and in order to create this sort of resistance?
Can you rephrase it? Can you say it again?
Yeah, I think there was. Basically, do you think the social networks might work for you guys to get your work read and to help these films be seen?
I think in some sense it feels like more people are having access to like reading about these movies that you would otherwise never see, or maybe that's just like in our bubble, because sometimes if you write about something and you can spread it on social media, it feels like it's being read by more people, but I don't know if that's actually true. But I do think it does help. Like, I think nowadays you can read as good of a piece on a not officially, like not an actual publication. You could read someone writing something on Letterboxd that's more interesting than what's being written in a magazine nowadays by someone who's not being paid, or they're not a professional writer. So in that way, I think it's opened up, like social media has opened up criticism in a lot of ways, which is interesting. And yeah, I mean, there's some people who think tweeting is a form of criticism, but that's another topic probably.
Yeah, I mean, like writing for Letterboxd, I think you could argue that it's harmed the profession of film criticism in certain ways, but it's also, I think you're getting genuine thought because you're not being paid to do that. You're doing it because you're passionate about what you want to say and you want people to read it, and there's no strictures on what you can or can't say or how long or short it needs to be. It's whatever you feel like the energy that you have geared towards your thoughts on a specific movie, you can just put that in to whatever form you want. And yeah, it's not being molded to a specific publication's template. I know every publication seems to have some sort of template. Even CinemaScope, every standard review I write for them needs to be 1,300 words. So whatever the film is, if it's 3 hours long, if it's 70 minutes, it needs to be a 1,500 word piece. And so, you know, there's a sense that it's a collaboration between how I feel about the movie, what I have to say about the movie, and the template of what I need to, the goals that I need to meet for the form of the publication. But when you have something like Letterboxd, for example, then there's a lot of freedom there. So you're getting more the personality, I think, of the writer, and their specific thoughts on that specific film in a way that I think is pretty nice.
Social media helps someone like me, I would say, because I'm just a freelance critic. I guess we didn't really introduce, or I mean, Pedro did, but I don't know exactly what you said. But like, I'm a freelance critic, so I don't write for like just one place. So like a social media network for me helps. I know I consistently write for like 6 or 7 different places probably, and then upwards of over like a dozen in just in a general sphere. So like, all my stuff can be kind of pushed to people through this 1 or 2 outlets, whereas if that didn't exist, I don't know what would happen exactly. But
and I should also say that I do also, in addition to the 4 pieces a year that I write for CinemaScope magazine, I also do film festival coverage for Filmmaker magazine, which is online posts, usually from the Cannes Film Festival, but I've also done the Berlinale, the Berlin Film Festival. And again, it's because it's a blog format. That one actually is a bit closer to, I guess, what you would have with Letterboxd, in the sense that there's freedom to the form that I can take. My sentences can run as long as I want them to. My paragraphs can be as long or as short as I want them to. The dispatch can be 3,000 words if I really feel like it needs to be, or it could be 700 words. And so it's definitely a different type of mindset that I have to be in when I'm writing these dispatches, which also have to come very shortly after I see a film, because in that sense it is sort of playing into the machine of the rapid film response thing that I was sort of bemoaning when I was talking about IndieWire and all these other trade publications, is that when you're at a film festival, you do have to respond somewhat quickly, and you do want to, you want to do well for the publication who's paid to send you there, and get them the clicks that they probably want you to get them, because you're writing about films that hardly anyone else is writing about. And so you can't really digest the film for several weeks like I do when I'm writing for CinemaScope. And so yeah, those are the 2 things that I participate in. But yeah.
Considering these thoughts, for example, on Letterboxd and how it helps you to feel more free, do you think that film criticism, or particularly your work, would benefit from not having an editor or an outlet which has a sort of input on the sort of stuff that you do? Would you prefer to be entirely free?
no.
Yeah.
I mean, I think my best writing has been a collaboration with the editor normally. I mean, the editors I work with, or I've worked with over the last like 8 or 9 years, like Michael Koreski, Mark Parenson, just to name a couple good ones, Andrew Tracy. But these people are co-authors in a sense on the best pieces probably, because they are the ones who like suss out different ideas or make you expand on certain things, make you cut back on certain things. That would be my personal thing, like getting too long-winded and like elaborate when it, like being concise is one thing that I've learned from these places. But yeah, that's the main thing. If you write for an IndieWire, like you can clearly read the site and it's not been edited in any kind of like thorough way. I'm sure someone reads it through once really quickly, but like these magazines and other places that take longer to publish, like a Reverse Shot, for example, you know, it's a small website, but it's thoroughly edited. Sometimes I go back and forth for like a week with Michael Koreski, who edits that site, figuring out, you know, how best to articulate something rather than just post it because people are interested in the movie that day or that week. And those are the pieces that hold up. I mean, I've had to do, you know, festival coverage where you write in a 2-hour block and then that's out there, but that stuff's awful and I can go back and know that it's not good, but that's also like a necessary evil in some sense. But yeah, you need to be edited.
Yeah, and I'm also, I think, slightly dyslexic, and so like I can reread a piece like 5 times and be like, okay, that's good, and then I'll send it away and I'll read it again and just find 3 or 4 more typos. And so I need someone to like be able to read it, something that I've written, and be able to say, what you're saying here is either grammatically incorrect or also like whatever you're trying to say as an idea that someone else can understand, it's not happening. Like you need to like, I don't know what you're saying right here. You need to smooth this out, and maybe this is what you're saying, and maybe this is a way that you can try to say that better. And so I personally need an editor. The first publication I ever wrote for film criticism for the editor-in-chief did not edit, and every single piece that I would publish for them would just be filled with errors, and it was unreadable, and I'm surprised anyone ever hired me for anything else after that, because everything I wrote for them was just unreadable. I don't know how I'm sitting here right now, but yeah, a good editor I think won't convert your voice into their voice. I think they'll just find a way of getting you to say what you are trying to say in a way that is still said in your terms, but not but is actually makes sense for people.
Yeah, and I think the best editors ask, like a lot of the edits I get are not even like specific things, they're like questions, like, oh, they're like almost rhetorical, like just like their thoughts too on certain sentences or ideas that you don't even have to implement, but that sometimes stirs kind of like my thought process, and then I'm like, oh, I guess I could like expand on or go that route with it. But yeah, I mean, the places all range from how thorough they are to how lenient they are on the editing, but yeah, you can always, I think you can tell by the writing for most cases.
But I think that's part of the form also of a site like Letterboxd, which hopefully everyone, or mostly everyone here, knows what we're talking about when we talk about Letterboxd, because I realize that we're just talking about it and just assuming that everyone knows what that is. But it's part of the form of Letterboxd. Like I don't go there expecting to see some brilliant prose with beautiful sentence structure and very neatly structured paragraphs that are all approximately 5 to 7 sentences long. Like I know that I'm looking at writing that's basically someone just spilling thoughts out and just clicking send, and sometimes I don't know what someone's saying, but at the same time, like you also get perhaps a clear expression of a certain enthusiasm or type of energy that the person had received from the film that you wouldn't get from something that has been edited and more ironed out after several editorial passes. And so I think it's a different, you get certain things from the different mediums of the different types of publications.
Now, I think it's an important question because film criticism, I think it's going through a very hard period. I don't believe that anyone can live on film criticism alone anymore. Maybe 50, 60 years ago, someone could be hired by a newspaper or a magazine, become a staff writer, and live just writing film criticism. But I think you can't do it anymore. And my question is, should it be that way? Should a film critic be strictly a film critic, or have you guys on your careers as also a programmer and a filmmaker had some sort of benefit from the experience of having multiple jobs in your film criticism?
Jordan's going to have a different answer to this than I will, because he actually, I think, makes his living mostly now off of film criticism, whereas I don't. I think there's certain value and so I write basically 4 pieces a year for CinemaScope, and then I do some festival coverage that doesn't remotely cover my annual living expenses. I'm also a PhD student at the University of Toronto, which has its own funding, which will eventually run out actually very soon. And I am hoping that degree will turn into an academic position of some kind, which will be my main sustenance for living and working. I am also a filmmaker, but if any of you saw the film that I had at Black Canvas 2 years ago, you probably know full well that I don't make a living off of my filmmaking either. And so I think for me it's a matter of finding a job that I can use to sustain myself and continue making films and continue to occasionally write about films. And I don't do either of those things because I'm dependent on the funding that I receive from those things, which obviously is something I'm very fortunate in order to say. But I would be writing very differently and be writing for many different publications if that weren't the case, if I were depending on my criticism in order to make a living, or if I were dependent on the filmmaking that I was doing. I would be making very different films. I wouldn't be making films according to just the impulses that I have and the experimentation that I'm interested in doing. I would be making things that I think are accessible to a wider audience. And these are just part of the demands that making money, puts on you, is that you need to make things that have a more mass appeal if you want to make money off of that. And so I'm fortunate that I don't have to do that, at least right now. But I think that helps with my criticism because I can just write what I want to write. I don't have to write, about films like we were saying earlier that I don't want to write about. And yeah.
Well, yeah, in addition to writing, I do programming in Los Angeles, just like a screening series and a small festival and some other kind of 3-4 day events throughout the year. But I do consider programming itself also a form of advocacy. And I think that and criticism should be, I think they're quite related. I think the best programmers are actually critics of some sort that write. And Blake does programming as well. I'm sure he would concur with that. But yeah, for me, as like what I show in Los Angeles, I have people ask me all the time, like, "Oh, do you like the movie?" I'm like, "Well, yeah, I'm showing the movie." Maybe it's lost on some people, but if I'm showing the movie, I clearly think it's an important or interesting thing that should be seen. And in LA, it's hard to explain if you don't live there, but getting certain movies to show there is very difficult. The movies that are showing here do not show in LA for the most part, unless the organization I run, called Acropolis Cinema, or 2 or 3 other organizations, if they don't step up to show them, they won't ever show in Los Angeles. So yeah, for me, that I need both to also make a living, but I try not to compromise all that much. Recently, a organization wanted us to show a film, and I wanted to do it, and then the title got switched at the last minute, but I hadn't seen the other film, and I had to back out of it. And I felt bad, but I was I don't have time to watch the movie. It was needed to be announced within a day. And I was I just can't do it. I'm sure the movie's good, but I don't want to put my name behind it or the organization's name behind it unless I believe in the movie. So yeah. Is that what, I don't know what, is that what your question was kind of going?
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, I think most of the better film critics do something else also, if it's programming or filmmaking. I think as someone who makes films and writes about it, I even though I'm not making industrial cinema that is often some of the cinema that I'm writing about, there's a certain thought process and type of decision making that goes into making a film that unless you've done that, you don't really know what that's like, and to then start to write about the decisions that other filmmakers are making in your criticism without ever having done that yourself, then it in a way it doesn't make sense. You're just projecting a certain assumption that is very likely to be wrong. And so or if you have never programmed films and know about the decisions that go into that, it's not always just like, oh, I like all these films, so I'm just going to have them play in my festival, or I'm going to have them play in my screening series. There are strictures that go into the decisions that a programmer has to make or a curator has to make. And I think when you're writing about a film festival, having some firsthand experience with how those things play out and how those decisions are made will go into how you write about the films that are playing at that film festival, and will give you a perspective that I think it's necessary in order to be able to talk about what those things are. And so if all you've done is just watched movies growing up and now you've started writing about them, then your perspective on them is just informed by cinema, and you're watching cinema, and that's not necessarily not valuable, but it is not as dynamic as someone who is more active in the industry in other ways other than just watching movies and writing about movies. And so I think it's useful for people to get their hands dirty in some way in the industry that's outside of just writing about movies. Because I can usually tell when I'm reading a film review or a piece of film criticism by someone who only writes about movies. They'll typically just address the movie as a response to other movies, whereas oftentimes a movie is responding to things that have to deal with life and living and the decisions that you have to make in order to make a movie from your perspective and from the culture that you're in. And I think, doing that firsthand is helpful.
And I think to take your question almost like in a slightly different direction, like I think the best writers also have interests in other art forms. You can tell when someone is well versed in whether it's like literature or like art, like painting or something else. Some films, necessitate some other knowledge, which I don't have in certain fields too. But I always try and keep learning things about other art forms, because it shouldn't necessarily exist in a bubble.
We used to write about music, which is its own,
right. Yeah.
Perspective that is somewhat unusual in terms of, like you came into film criticism after being a critic about music, which, so you had experience writing about a certain type of art that is very sensual and not visual, and so you're used to writing about art that's different from how most film critics end up just writing about.
Yeah, and I think when you write about the kind of films Blake and I do, we've been talking mostly about like kind of feature-length stuff, but we write about a lot of experimental cinema too, which also necessitates some sort of other knowledge, because most of those filmmakers are bringing other influences in, not just cinematic. Most of the filmmakers you talk to don't usually name, or they name artists and other vocations other than filmmakers as their inspirations. And kind of visually, aesthetically, they're pulling from different traditions that I think the best writers, try and tap into or learn from as well. So it's a process, at least for me. I mean, we're both fairly young, so there's a lot more. I definitely am not an authority on certain things, but it's good to keep learning.
I think this is fascinating because, many people think that the film critics have to be obsessed about film strictly. And in my experience as well, I've come to find that it is very important to be informed about a lot of other stuff, even history or politics, because you can question a filmmaker. And that leads me to an idea, which is, should a film critic fight the ideas of a film at times based on his or her political or philosophical ideas? Do you find that interesting or stimulating or even right in a way?
I guess it depends on the writer. But yeah, I mean, nowadays you see definitely, like we were talking about sort of before, you see more of that nowadays where the writer's bringing their personal, political ideals to the film and to the writing, which is good and productive, and a lot of great writing is being done in that regard. But then at the same time, it's when you write about like jokers in the political aspect, I mean, there's something to be said about that film probably politically, but like approaching it from that way isn't always necessarily the most interesting thing. But yeah, it depends on the writer, I think, and the film. Certain films don't, I don't think, necessitate a lot of political. People like to put political beliefs onto films that probably aren't even that smart to like even wrestle with those ideas, I think.
I mean, I think the person writing about the film should write about the film in the way that interests them. If they had a very strong reaction to it because of some political idea they had while watching it, then of course they should write about it that way. But if it was a totally hypnotic experience for them, that was sort of an out-of-body experience, and it was just a Zen state that they were in, then they should write about the film in those terms. I don't think your response to every film will be political, and I don't think your response to every film will be sensual or based on formalist or aesthetic means. But you know, if you find a film interesting enough that it's worth your time to spend many hours or days writing about it, then you should hopefully be writing about it within the terms that interest you. And I think that's the only way that your writing will be interesting to other people, or valuable to how that film is thought about by other people who end up reading your piece. And so, yeah, I don't think a political film needs to be discussed from someone who's writing about it from a political standpoint. I think there are useful ways of talking about any film. Any film could be talked about politically, and any political film could be talked about in terms of just a more sensualist vocabulary or a more formalist vocabulary. I think it's good to just say what interests you.
I think that's very important too, and this leads me to the idea of subjectivity. For some reason, there is this old cliche that tells us that objectivity is the most important thing in a film critic or a journalist or a thinker and so on. But I believe that subjectivity is very important because it helps create a larger, more complex conversation by not reading a single opinion on a film, but many. Do you think that film criticism should be more of a dialogue, not just between the writer and his or her audience, but between all the writers with their different perspectives?
I think so, yeah, in some sense. I definitely like to read other people's opinions. Sometimes it's healthy or good to read like a completely different opinion of yours. And then people bring different backgrounds to films and different ideas to movies. And depending on the subject matter, you could have a completely different response. So it's very probably healthy to look at those and realize you're not the last word maybe on something. And especially, you know, we're two like mid-30s men. There's like obviously women, people of color talking about certain films that should be talked about in different ways probably, or that they can do that I can't do. And you see that a lot now, which is good for film criticism probably in the overall sense.
Yeah, I mean, this sort of goes away from your question and more towards what he just said, but like I for the last 12 years have gone to the Cannes Film Festival, which is considered by many to be the most important single film festival in the world and the most populated with critics, and a press screening for that will have over 1,000 critics in a room. And I can usually count on one hand, if not just two hands, the number of people of color in the room. And certainly the percentage of women in the room is usually 10% or less. And so a lot of the reporting that you end up getting about these very widely anticipated movies will just be by a very specific demographic and who have a very biased experience of the world that is not shared by most of the other people who might be interested in what these films are doing or saying. And so I don't think any single writer should pretend that they're striving for objectivity in their own writing, because you are a single person, you are a subject, and whatever you say will be your subjective response. And to strive for an objective reading of a film is ridiculous and pointless.
Now, I find an aspect of film criticism very interesting, which doesn't happen a lot here in Mexico, because it's only during certain festivals that we get to meet a very certain limited number of directors and so on. But interviewing, I think, is very interesting in its relationship to a film critic's work. Does it enhance what you do? Does it make you question sometimes what you've just written about a film, or what you're thinking about it, or what you're going to write about it?
Reading someone else's?
Well, interviewing filmmakers, or perhaps, of course, reading a filmmaker's answers about his work or her work.
It can color your opinion a little bit, I think. I do a lot more interviews nowadays, but sometimes I'll interview someone, I'll be like, I can understand what the filmmaker was going for in a different way sometimes, and I appreciate the film more, or they bring up something I'm not even aware of. Usually I'm interviewing someone I already like the film and stuff like that. I'm not usually assigned to interview someone beforehand, before I see a movie. Sometimes that happens, but yeah, I do think it can be productive to interview filmmakers and see. I mean, Blake's coming at it as a filmmaker too, so he has a different perspective. But if I interview Blake about his films, I'll get something. I haven't done it yet. Maybe I should. But I've done Q&As with him and stuff like this. But you hear him do, or you talk about cinema in a way that you're probably not aware of because you don't do it. Not that I think you need to. Obviously, I'm a critic. I don't think you need to do the profession to be able to talk about it. But I do think it can be helpful and stimulating to hear even an actor talk about their process, and it can help you appreciate things more. And then sometimes you can interview someone and be like, they don't even know what, or I think sometimes the filmmaker isn't aware of what their film is in some sense. Sometimes
Filmmakers are never aware of what their film is, actually.
Well, once they're done with it, it's out of their hands and it can take on a life of its own, which is one of the more interesting aspects, I think, of art making.
Yeah, I think if I have a response to a film and then I either interview a filmmaker, which I typically avoid doing, or read an interview with that filmmaker, and I feel as though that has altered my reading of the film or my response to the film, then I think that's just an illusion, and I think it's not good. I think the most important thing is the film itself and the response I get from that, and extraneous information from the filmmaker or the crew or other people involved in the making of it just lead to distortions of my response to it. But I do think they're valuable for other things, not for altering my reading of the film or response to it, but for more information about the process of making movies, or the way that filmmaker thinks and what that filmmaker is influenced by, that might make me have interesting ideas about filmmaking or ways of being inspired. But I hope that I'm not influenced too much by what a filmmaker says, because a filmmaker can say very extremely interesting things about their films, but if that was not something that hit me while I was watching it, then their film, in that sense, might be a failure. But I don't think a film needs to do what the filmmaker was hoping it would do in order for the film to be very good or very useful or very important either. So.
intentions don't always equal the results, probably desired results necessarily, which can be good and bad. But.
Yeah, definitely. And well, I think we've covered a lot of very interesting subjects here. And I would like to finally ask you about something perhaps very general and very hard to know. But do you believe that in the societies we live in, again, these mediatized societies where neo-fascism is rising, where industrial reviewing and filmmaking seems to captivate most people, do you believe that film criticism, the sort of film criticism that questions films or that thinks about them in a way in which it tries to start a conversation with the work and with the audience might survive? Do you think that it has a future, or do you think that it will have an easy sort of living, or do you think that you have to fight for that to live on, for that tradition to live on?
I think it'll continue, maybe in different forms, as we've already talked about some of these different channels and things. I don't know if it's like a sustainable career, but I think as long as people keep doing it, it's going to survive in its own way. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if perhaps, yeah, as he's saying, that as a sustainable career, it may disappear. I think there are a number of forces that might lead to that happening, not just the kind of ridiculous authoritarian nature of many countries that's very popular right now for some reason, but I think there will always be films. Cinema won't die, it'll just evolve into something else that we'll probably still call films and cinema, and people having thoughts about those things that we call films and cinema will also always exist, and people will always find a means of publishing those thoughts. And I think the useful thing about a professional film critic that is able to make a living off of that is that we can call them an expert on it, and we can view them as an authority on what a film means. But I think in certain ways, expert opinions are valuable, because some people are more informed and have more interesting thoughts than others about films. But I think in a film criticism landscape that has nobody who's making a living off of doing that, and so you have, I think that creates fears that everyone will just be non-experts, but I don't think that's true. I think you'll always have people who have more followers or have more likes, and their postings will rise up to the top of feeds and the Reddit aggregators or whatever, and those will be read more, and you'll have a different kind of expert that emerges, but there will always be experts within the field. They may just not be making money off of their expertise, but I think there will still be value, and there will still be a tradition of it, but just people might just have to do something else in order to pay the bills.
Well, I would like now to open the mic for questions from the audience. I don't know if anyone has any question. You might just stand up and shout it as loud as you can, please, because I don't think we have a mic for this. If you want to do it in Spanish, I can translate it for the guy. So, oh, there's the mic. There's a question over there. Thank you very much.
Well, hi guys, I'm Alvaro, and first of all, it's a great honor to have you here today in the university. And well, at the beginning of the presentation, you said that we can find some key points or spoilers on a film criticism because we are talking about the plot of a film. But my question for you guys is, despite the plot, which other elements of a film do you consider important to make a film criticism and create a relationship between your criticism and the reader? I'll be pleased to hear your answers, guys.
Well, for me, I think I was the one who specifically mentioned spoilers. I mean, I think anything as any sort of information about the film is a spoiler going into it. I don't even watch trailers for movies that I know I'm going to see, that I want to see, just because I don't want to have any images in my head or expectations based on some trailer editor and how they wanted to make a trailer and edit that together. Like, I don't want that shaping how I'm going to go into a movie and certain expectations that I have, because for me, watching a movie is about entering into some unknown, and then I then start receiving information, audiovisual information, and certain ideas that unfold in a way that the filmmaker and the editor of the film wanted the film to be revealed to me in a specific way. And so to have information about what happens later on in the plot that might inform how I'm responding to something that happens at the beginning of the movie, like, that's a distortion of my experience of the movie that I would prefer to avoid. And so that's why when I say that I write about a movie, I'm writing about the movie in a way that is hopeful that the person reading it has already seen the film, so that I'm not shaping their experience, their first encounter with the movie. And ideally, my relationship with the viewer then is about communicating why I think the movie is important, and why, and perhaps relating some context about the filmmaking or the traditions, whether it's art traditions or film traditions or whatever traditions that the film is coming from, that perhaps other viewers might not be aware of or might not have thought of, and just trying to provide extra angles for approaching a movie that might be frustrating or challenging for someone who hasn't seen films by that filmmaker before, or seen films that were made in that tradition before. Because I think, some people will have been watching films for 50 years when they go into a movie. Some people might have just started watching interesting films for the first time. And so I think it can be useful to read someone who has researched the topic or seen more films in that tradition before, and they can provide an angle that might not have revealed itself otherwise. But yeah, so if I'm writing for someone who has already seen the film, then I don't need to say too much about the plot. Then, yeah, that's more or less what I meant by that. But
yeah, I'm somewhat different than Blake on the spoiler front. I don't think a good movie can actually be spoiled. I don't really watch a lot of trailers and stuff beforehand, but I'll read about a film I haven't seen. I don't think it matters. It doesn't bother me personally, but that's why everyone has a choice whether to read something beforehand or watch a trailer beforehand. But as far as just focusing on certain aspects of the writing, for me, I also I approach things maybe more in a formal or stylistic point of view on certain films. But also, yeah, in the writing, I try to contextualize. I try and see as much. I try to not write about a filmmaker that I have not well versed in their films, so I can kind of place that film within their work, and then if you can place it within a wider tradition, because if they're a documentary filmmaker, if they're making experimental work, you should hopefully have a knowledge of these things, whether it's their work or their tradition they're working in. But that's not to say that a person's opinion isn't valid if they haven't seen this person's other work. But I think for me personally, I try and put that into the writing, so if the person's not aware of the filmmaker's work, they can be like, okay, this is like a progression, this is their themes, their subject matter, their sensibility as a filmmaker or artist. I think that's helpful. At least for me, that's the best writing, or the writing I enjoy kind of places something. I'll be like, oh, this person has decades of work or many prolific career that I'm not aware of, and it helps for me as a reader. But yeah, maybe not for everybody.
I think we had a question over here.
Hi guys. My question, I think, is more specifically for Blake. As a person that aspires to be a filmmaker, do you think I can find value in obviously watching a ton of movies, but also writing about movies? Do you think that's something that could be for value for me or everyone else that want to be a filmmaker? like basically for me, and also if I could find value in immersing myself in the world of film critique in a way that maybe has a lot more care for clarity and grammar and stuff like that, instead of just making some notes or vomiting something to a page like you were talking about Letterboxd. So maybe Letterboxd is useful to just externalize my thoughts, but do you think that I can find value in actually having some editorial thoughts and making the grammar better and polishing the writing? Thank you.
To the extent that I kind of understand the basics of what you're asking, I think the best way to be to strengthen one's filmmaking is just to make movies, and I do think that writing about films for me has been a way of articulating what interests me and figuring that out. Because as I was saying earlier, I don't often know why I liked a movie until I've started writing about it, and I do think that articulating certain things for myself in words does help with certain ideas that I'll eventually have later on for making a movie. Obviously, like certain techniques and like just having a general sense of like where to place a camera or how to record sound and how to cut a film together will come, I don't think, from writing about anything. It'll just come from doing that over and over again and figuring out how to do that in a way that finally feels comfortable for yourself. Because when you first start making movies, I think you can convince yourself that you've done something great, and then you watch it with people, and sitting with other people watching it, I think you start to understand what's working and what's not working, and then it's just important to grab onto the things that are working and be able to identify, okay, this thing that I did it didn't come out, it's bad, and so when I do it next time, I'm not going to do that. And so I've been fortunate enough that I've been able to work on all of my films by myself. I shoot them, I conceive of them, I do the sound for them, I edit them, and I make DCPs of them, and then I release them. And so that has as much to do with the type of films that I make as any other thing. But when you're working with other people, obviously you're collaborating with their strengths and weaknesses, and you have to try to find a way to make something together that is hopefully all strength and no weakness. But yeah, I think doing as many different things as possible, just as making a film can strengthen your criticism in a certain way, I think that writing about films will strengthen your filmmaking in certain ways, even if it's ways that you don't realize, because you're just thinking through something for yourself. And yeah, I think that's good to do.
Do we have another question from the audience? Tenemos una allá atrás.
Hi. So I was wondering, in the sense when you start making a criticism about a movie, well, not a criticism, but you start writing about a movie, when you learn about the movie and the way it was conceived and the first, I don't know, things that moved the director to do that work, but you have like an opposite kind of thinking about what it's actually about, but it's, it's not okay. I mean, it's not the right thing, but you interpret it in a different way. How do you express that without being like, different, the different perspective about the film of the director without being, like, how do you say it, like, well, yeah, not, I don't know how to say it, but.
I think, well, if I understand it correct, your question, that can be tricky, I think. If you know the filmmaker's intentions, or you've heard he or she talk about their process or their intentions, and then you have a completely different reading on the film, that's usually when you get a negative review, I guess, in most cases. But that can also be productive, and I think For me, I mean, sometimes that's good to acknowledge, I think, within the writing, and I'll do that sometimes. You can be like, this is their, how they conceived of the film, and then this is how how it sat with me and how I've interpreted it, and that, yeah. I don't know if I have a good answer for the question, but I do think it does happen, and it can be, it can lead to really good, stimulating writing, because, like we were saying before, the filmmaker's intentions aren't necessarily, that doesn't mean the finished film is what they thought it is or what they wanted it to be. Of course, you're not going to hear them say like that they did something wrong usually, but it's definitely interesting to kind of unpack certain ideas. And a film can be really good. Like, a film can be very good, in my opinion, that is not even in the filmmaker's intention, and the opposite. I don't know if it is for you.
Yeah, I don't know if I have anything to add. I think certain intentions will come through when you're watching it. I think it's hardly ever mysterious about what certain things about kind of the core ideas or the core senses that were trying to be evoked from the movie. And I don't think evaluating the movie is a matter of deciding if the film was successful in doing whatever the intentions were, because I think a film might set out to make you feel deeply unpleasant about certain things, and the film might successfully do that, and that doesn't mean the film is good or useful or valuable, to me anyway. But usually when I'm watching a movie the first time, I'm in a zone where I'm not really thinking too much. I'm not consciously processing in a cognitive way what I'm looking at. I typically don't even grasp the plot of the movie very well the first time I'm watching it, and like what certain characters are doing or motivations or whatever. I'm just kind of letting it be on a screen in front of me, and hopefully certain things will announce themselves to me as interesting or affecting in a certain way that I'll think is good, and then usually I'll get more information about what the intentions were the second time I see it, with the plot or with the themes or whatever. But to me, my relationship with the movie is always primarily from a sensual point of view, and that's how I watch the movie. So I acknowledge that that's not necessarily how most people watch movies, and so when I'm writing about cinema, I'm writing about it from the perspective that someone is reading my writing and might also watch films that way, and might respond to films in a similar way that I do. But everyone has different critics that they follow who watch films in a way that's more aligned with how they watch films, and so I don't expect that when I'm writing about a film, my reading of it or my reaction to it will be the reaction to it or the reading of it. It's just my reading of it, and I don't pretend that it's anyone else's reading of it other than my own, and I can only just kind of hope that there's perhaps something universal in my response to the movie, that other people will find some commonality with it and think that what I'm saying about the movie makes sense in some way. If it makes sense to me, then that's all I can really count on, and it doesn't matter what anyone else says, including the filmmaker. If I responded to a movie in a certain way, then that's how I responded to it.
It's like the most famous example of that approach, or one of them, was it Rivette who wrote the tracking shot in Capo piece? This is sort of maybe niche for people who aren't into criticism, but French filmmaker wrote a piece about a war film, and then essentially took one shot where the filmmaker moved the camera and took down the entire film as from a political standpoint because the filmmaker moved the camera. What did he move the camera to? It was a dead body, right? Yeah. So this is a Holocaust film, right? So yeah, it's something to look into if you haven't seen that. But that would be a very prominent example of the filmmaker clearly did not intend to offend or that wasn't their intention with moving the camera. But a good critic can run with their interpretation of what that means aesthetically, politically, and come up with like one of the most like probably influential or renowned like pieces of film criticism based on like literally one shot. So, yeah.
One perfect shot. Well, we have time for one more question from the audience. Yeah, we got one behind. 2 questions. Great. So we can go with that one and then yours.
Thank you. So, I mean, did you ever had like negative reactions to your critics, and how did you handle it? Like in a more like personal way, a negative reaction from the viewers or even filmmakers itself. How you handled like that?
When we write something, do we get
yes.
negative response to?
Yes.
How do we handle?
When you
Negative response from like an audience, like
yes.
a reader?
Maybe
I thought you
audience, or maybe even.
I thought you meant something else. Okay, I've had both. I've had filmmakers tell me like I'm wrong about things, which goes into what we were saying before. That didn't come from an interview, but like sometimes I'll write about something and get an email, and this hasn't happened very often, but like they'll correct something. If it's factual, of course, that is one thing. The other thing is like they're telling you what they were meaning by this, and you took it a different way. I mean, we probably don't write for places that we don't get a lot of like hate mail.
Yeah, if you write for IndieWire, then no matter what you write, you'll get negative comments in the comment section.
I used to get more. I've definitely got more like negative responses from readers when I used to write about music. I don't know if that's just more volatile environment or something than I have with film. Sometimes we're writing about such niche films that like your audience is almost critics and the filmmakers in some cases, which your response tends to come from people within your field or the actual filmmaker. But yeah.
The only time I really get negative response is when I'm doing the festival dispatches, which is not surprising because I think it's weaker writing because it's writing that's done in an environment that's not conducive to good film writing. But I write in such a way that I'm just trying to like put words together in a way that kind of somehow articulates how I responded to a movie. And so when I'm doing festival dispatches like for Cannes, including this year, especially since I'm doing it for an online site that has a comment section, I will go back after the festival and see if there were comments. And usually there are people who tell me that my sentences are too long and that I'm not writing a book, I'm just writing a film capsule review, and I need to like get it together, and that I don't really care too much about. But like I said, when I'm writing about something, if I'm making a film, if I'm writing a film review, or if I'm programming a series at a film festival, it's implicitly an argument for why I'm doing it. If I'm making a film, it's an argument for its own existence. If I'm writing a film review, it's an argument for a type of film or a specific film that I think is being underappreciated. And so naturally there's some sort of built-in almost antagonism to the status quo in what I'm doing. And so I understand that might occasionally ruffle feathers because I'm writing about something that I think people aren't treating properly. Not enough people are watching it, not enough people are appreciating it, not enough people are understanding it or whatever. And so, or if there's a film that's considered to be very good, the only time I'll write negative comments on a film is during the festival coverage. And so like I didn't particularly like the new Quentin Tarantino movie, and so some people didn't like that I didn't like the new Quentin Tarantino movie, and so that, people will voice that opinion. But other than that, like I think the form that I'm taking or the position that I'm always taking is towards advocacy for an opinion or a thought that I think is underrepresented, and so that can create tension, but tension is always good. Disagreement I think is good because it generates discussion and more, it generates thought and passion, so it's always good.
Aquí tenemos una última pregunta. Aquí adelante.
Okay, I think maybe you guys already talked like something in relation to this, but how can you guys draw audience to longer format of film critique when you have sites like Rotten Tomatoes? That is like actually not even film critique, it's just like film grading, and not even that. It's just like the average is like in a little piece down, and obviously the squash tomato is very like marketable and it's very impressive and it's very like radical. And even IndieWire and Variety and Hollywood Reporter stuff are like way down on the page, and people have to look for it. And especially younger millennials and Gen Zers. I know it's like 3 clicks more, but we have so like little attention span that for us it's like, oh no, it's a huge effort. I'm not gonna do that. And so, or do you guys don't even care about that and you just write the best piece that you can and just hope that people read it?
I don't know if I heard everything there, but I think like I don't mind aggregate sites like Rotten Tomatoes like as a concept, but I think there is like a fundamental misunderstanding of what these sites do for a lot of people who don't pay attention to like criticism. Like these are literally just like the review is positive or negative. Like sometimes I'm like that movie is pretty good, and they would give it like it would be considered a positive review. The same designation that a film that I think is like a masterpiece would get the same thing. So there's like gradations within opinions that aren't reflected in aggregate sites. There was a couple other sites that use like a little more nuanced things like Metacritic and stuff like this, where they like assign ratings to your reviews.
Well, they don't let 500 hack critics.
Yeah, well, Rotten Tomato also has
the
way too big of a
aggregate
pool of writers. That gets down, into other issues like what's considered a film critic now. Because if you write for a blog, should you be considered part of these sites and stuff like that? But yeah, as a concept, I don't mind these, or as an idea, I don't mind them. But I just think people there's a misunderstanding of how they operate.
Yeah, I think that the most valuable thing to me about a site like Letterboxd is it's a make your own aggregate. Like you follow the people that you think you agree with, and then you can get to ignore everybody else who you think their opinion doesn't reflect your own usually. And so I use Letterboxd both as a site that for my own logging and also for when I'm just going on it to look at what my followers are seeing and thinking of movies is just for the ratings. And if I need to decide to see a movie, I will go and see if the people who I follow generally responded well to the movie. If they did, then I'll check it out. If not, then I won't. And I won't have to count on the fact that Rotten Tomatoes has like, I don't know, 90+% of fresh ratings for a movie that usually I will think is worthless. And so I think there's a sense that something like Metacritic is better just because it's a more refined group of people, but it's still like, I still don't agree typically with most of who people consider to be the top critics anyway. Like I said, I watch movies in a way that I think is not very popular, or that other people watch movies the same way I do. And so I try to find people who aren't necessarily professionals who do watch movies similarly to the way that I do. And so I think Rotten Tomatoes has actually been pretty harmful to the film community over the last 15 years. I think it's caused people to think that a certain kind of cinema is the best kind of cinema, because a certain type of movie is always the one that ends up with the universal praise, whereas those movies are usually not doing radical or interesting things that might risk alienating their audience, which I think if you're not risking that, then you're probably not doing something that's contributing to the conversation about anything. You're just trying to make a movie that's complying to a tradition of quality that is, I think we're probably all ready to move on from. And so I think most of the films that are playing at Black Canvas are some of the better films from this year, but I think most of them would not get very good tomato ratings. And so people would ignore them, and I think that's not good.
There was a site that's not around anymore called Critics Roundup, which like the idea behind it was certain publications aren't considered actual publications, I guess, to Rotten Tomatoes and Metacritic. So like a Mubi, for example, or Senses of Cinema, I think CinemaScope 2. A number of places we write for aren't like aggregated on these sites. So this other site kind of took these other publications, which are probably more in like our wheelhouse, and that was like a fairly good barometer if you were like had the similar sensibility. But now, since that site is gone, you can, like Blake was saying, do it on Twitter or Letterboxd, follow the publications and or writers that you trust, and can make a more informed judgment on what you're going to spend your money on, as opposed to Rotten Tomatoes, which doesn't really tell you much other than the majority of people thought the movie was better than bad, really.
Yeah, but I mean, the people who go to Rotten Tomatoes are who the critics who are included in that scoring are the people who typically will like the Oscar films, and they won't like the films that aren't nominated for Oscars or whatever. And even with Critics Roundup, which did have a more interesting roundup of critics than most of these other aggregate sites, it was still one particular person's group of critics he trusted. And so, again, I agreed with a lot of them, but some of them I don't. And so I'm all for the make your own aggregate nature of a site like Letterboxd. Unfortunately, you end up with a lot of professional critics are on Letterboxd now too, so it's not just you rounding up a group of amateur people. Like, you have a good healthy mix of mostly amateurs, but also some professionals who can go into your own personal aggregate. And a lot of these things I think are just useful for making decisions on whether or not to see something that you haven't already decided to see. Usually if I'm going to watch a movie, I've already decided a long time ago that I was going to see it because I was interested in the filmmaker. And so, film criticism as a decider of something to see, I don't find very useful. I don't read film criticism in order to decide if I want to see something, because again, I have this problem where I don't want to know anything about the movie. So that's why I think ratings are useful. If a critic I like gave something an A- or a B+ or an A, then I'll good. But I don't need to read them analyzing a movie in order to decide if it's worth my time.
Well, thank you very much, guys, for being here. Let's have a round of applause for these guys.
Thank you.